you all right?
Yes, I'm not so bad. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Yeah, working hard, working
Yes.
very hard.
Well, I
Yes.
do. I know. I understand now that anyone who says, "Oh, education, it's 6 weeks off," and no, no, you work very hard in education.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's fun, is that part. And yeah, I'm enjoying it. How are you? You all right?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm merrily sorting my head through futures and stuff, and constantly going. You kind of get the up of like, yes, I know exactly where I'm heading and what I want to do, and then you kind of, I think it's the working class academic side of me kicks out and goes, "Am I really making the right choices?" And I've got to just balance myself occasionally. I've got to trust myself that I am making the right choices.
How are you coping with the cold weather?
Oh, it's interesting. I'm interestingly coping with it. I find it hideous in the morning, but because of what I do for a living now, which is basically looking after kids in playgrounds, I discovered today that throwing an American football continuously for 30 minutes not only hurts your arm, but keeps you really warm.
All right.
Mm.
Yeah, I got to admit, I went to the gym this morning and I was sort of like scraping frost off the windscreen and it was incredibly cold. But yeah, didn't mind it going to the gym. Yeah, it's just
No, no.
later
Well,
on.
afterwards, I bet when you do the run, you come out afterwards and you're like, you don't even want to wear your coat. You're quite happy for the
Yeah,
cold wind to cool you down a bit.
yes, usually I look like I've been involved in some sort of water sports activity. Yes.
Yeah. That was me today. It was the ice all over the place. The place is white with frost, and I'm there sweating. As if I don't know. I was sweating as if I realised I just backed Liz Truss in a race.
Now, do you know, the other day I was in a classroom and I actually used the phrase sweating like a priest in a playground. And this one Catholic student really did not like that phrase. Yeah, yeah. And asked,
Obviously,
why
never
did you use
been in
that?
a playground with a priest before.
He said, why did you use that? So it's alliterative, isn't it? So you got priest and playground, it works like that. And he wasn't happy with it though. Yeah.
I think it's alliterative. It's intertextual.
Yes,
You know,
it's true. Yeah.
meta.
Yeah. I mean, he said they're not all like that, but obviously he wasn't a very sexy choir boy.
No,
Um,
and also
so
it's
yeah,
Black Swan, isn't it? The whole Black Swan philosophy is all about that.
what's the Black Swan philosophy?
It doesn't matter how many white swans you see, they never prove that all swans are white. But the existence of one singular black swan proves that not all swans are white. So the existence of one pedophile priest proves that not all priests are actually good, wholesome people. But a good,
Yeah,
wholesome priest does not prove there are no pedophile priests.
we started off on a light tone today, haven't we?
And we get philosophy
Yeah.
very quickly. In
Yes.
that, yeah, I love it. I love that kind of thing. I think when we all, people sort of like nail their flag to an ism mast. What
Yes.
kind of ism you are. I think I'm definitely down the intertextual side of things and metafictional isms. I think they're my absolute go-to theories when looking at anything literal. I think.
Yeah, I think there's so much intertextuality because we can't really create one text without it being dependent on the existence of others. So yeah, I can
Yeah,
definitely see where you
and
get
you
that
can't
route.
read a
Yeah.
text without. You cannot fully give yourself into a text without taking away the idea that you're actually reading.
Yes. Yes, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I've been so immersed in books that I'm there thinking, where am I? Am I sort of like sitting here reading the book, or am I actually in this particular? Am I in Westeros or somewhere like that? But yeah, it's not a very long dispute. Yeah.
No, exactly. Then you come out of it and there's always that moment. There's always this relationship between the author and the reader. And talking about those kind of relationships,
Talking about those, What have we been reading this week, Col?
This week, Ash. This week oh God, I've got to look up the author again. We've been reading The Phantom Coach, not couch or any other kind of furniture. We have been reading The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. And this is. Are you ready for the synopsis? I've been trying to look. I've been trying to find a decent synopsis to read, and I can't really find one. So I'm going to do my own basic one. So basically,
right,
there's this geezer, who lives in Yorkshire, and he leaves it and he walks off to do his business. And this is not that kind of business, right? And he has to walk across the Yorkshire moors because this is the 1800s, about 1846, I think. And so it's the 1800s, and so he has to walk across the Yorkshire moors. And as in any good horror film like American Werewolf in London, he goes off the path and onto the moors, and then the fog comes down and he gets completely lost and he doesn't know where he is, and he starts thinking about death. And he starts thinking about his young wife and how she's not going to know where he is. And then he comes across this cottage, and he goes to the cottage and knocks on the door, and inside is a scholar who is a believer of the supernatural and not the complete science. And he's been ostracized by the science world because of his beliefs in the supernatural, but then goes on to actually state that by dismissing the supernatural completely, should something ever be a real ghost, then scientists will never properly look at it because they dismiss it, and that him being ostracized is obviously stupid like that. Then he realizes this geezer needs to get home. He's going to have to walk 20 miles or so once he realizes where he is. And the guy says, no, go and get this mail coach from these crossroads just up there, and that will take you home. It's the same mail coach that had an accident 9 years previous. And so he goes down to the crossroads and he gets on this mail coach, and as he's getting in, there's 3 people in the cage, and he's thinking, hang on, that's a bit odd. There's 3 people here. That makes 4. And 4 people died in the back of the mail coach as it went over the precipice of a deepness that crashed into. And then as he's riding along, he suddenly realizes that it's the coach from 9 years ago, that he's got onto this phantom coach, and that he goes through the same accident, and then he wakes up in hospital with his wife by his side. And even though he's never told his wife about this ghost, he has argued many, many times with the doctor about the existence of this coach. And he knows that exactly where he was found on the Yorkshire moors was exactly the position where this coach crashed 9 years previous. But it kind of alludes to that. The scientist doctor completely dismisses it and says he's just a fever dream, but he knows through his own senses that it was real. How's that?
That was very similar to the one I read, yes.
Very good. Thank God for that. So, Ash, what did you think?
I thought it was a story of 2 halves. I didn't see how it annoyed me in the middle when he's sort of like goes into the house and he eats a meal with the scholarly bloke. I did not see how that related to the conclusion of the story. It just seemed like that. It seemed like 2 story ideas had been jammed together, and it was Amelia needed a conclusion to the story and said, "All right, yeah, let's get him to go out to the mail coach." The mail coach part was one of the most horrifying things that I think we've read in all of the short stories that we've looked at. I thought that was one of the most well-executed pieces of horror writing, in the way that it was chilling, that he was trapped in there. It was a decrepit area. It was everything about it was just perfect for horror.
The descriptions of the smiles.
Yeah, that was just so chilling. Yeah. And yeah, every sense was ticked. It was cold in there. You could see breath. You could smell things. Things were rotting all around them. Everything about that part was perfect. But the whole idea of, I'm lost in the middle of a snowstorm. In that, there could have been a way for him to be put onto that mail thing without needing to go and have half an hour's waffle with Mr. Boring Bastard, who has been ostracised by all his friends. And I can understand why they ostracised the fucker. I would have ostracised him as well. Yeah, boring moron.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting because I decided to read a little bit more into it after that, because I had a similar sort of thing. I couldn't quite figure out what the scholar's role was in this. But to have some form of intellectual discussion about the existence of ghosts.
Right.
Right? That's the only thing I could see. Then I started reading into it. And then I started finding out that the discussion around this piece focuses on a feminist reading, where the scholar being ostracized is a representation of female writers not being taken seriously. And the idea of people believing in the supernatural compared to scientists at the time is very much the battle between women who were considered to be the supernatural ones, which is why all mediums were women that went round and did the spiritualist looks, and the patriarchy, which was very much the science idea. So the idea of believing in a ghost was very much a feminine concept compared to the idea of believing in science, which was the male concept. And the story itself, that part of the story, was to create that concept where the women are not believed, and then something happens that is actually real, and then nobody actually believes that happening because the patriarch will argue against it.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And I get that to some extent, but there are, it seems unusual that the female voice would be represented by someone who's so very, very male within the story.
Well, I think that's I can't state this one because unfortunately we can't speak to it, but I think that was kind of the point, was to create a male character. It's almost like what we would nowadays call a gender switch. You know, I've done it in my adaptation where I've taken a male character and made it a female character in order to create the change and play with the schemata. So the idea of, you know, because the idea of a woman walking alone across the moors in order to go to a job back in Victorian times would have been seen as too unbelievable. So the idea of it being a man getting lost and having this discussion with another man who's part of the patriarch is to create that kind of discussion.
Yeah, no, I think it needed to be the bloke who was getting lost on the moors, but he could have gone to a house where it was a female writer who was there, or a female who was showing him the hospitality. And
yeah, again,
that
it's that whole, he was a scholar. So it was that coming out of one type of, remember, this is what, 1840s, something like that, this was written. And so you've got to have that historical context with it. The concept of a woman being a scholar and actually not, I mean, you know, to be ostracized means that they got to look at you in the first place. They wouldn't have even looked at her as a female scholar back then. And it's like even women writers back then, a lot of them, you know, there's most, as we've discovered, a huge amount of horror stories and ghost stories, particularly ghost stories, were written by women, but quite a lot of them had to use male names in order to get published and things like that. So it's a very, I just thought it was an interesting, once that was put forward, of, okay, let's have a look at it from that point of view. And then you could almost see why that mechanism was there. The mechanism of the scholar was to create this idea of someone who isn't believed, rather than it just being a pure ghost story. You set something up so that the doctor at the end, who is the scientist, argues with him, and it gives that meaning, rather than it just being two blokes having an argument at the end over it.
It is a very interesting way of looking at it, and from a criticism point of view, I think it makes perfect sense. But it doesn't stop the fact that the story does seem pretty fucking clunky during those parts.
It is, that whole section is clunky. Yeah. So I'll give you. So like I say, it's just coming back on it. I totally agree with you. It's too divided in a way, isn't it? It's kind of like this character of the scholar is so shoehorned in.
Yeah.
But still wonderfully written, but for a different story. That's the...
Yeah, absolutely. Because, and again, from a feminist point of view, you sort of like got the male hero who's wandering across the snow. You've got the male servant. You've got the male scholar. The only female that we've got there is his wife, who turns up at the end to sort of like wipe his arse whilst he's recovering. Yes. And it is. It definitely backgrounds the female role within the story.
Yeah. and that's almost the point, isn't it? If you're making the point of females are backgrounded in Victorian society, then that's exactly what she's done in the story. She's backgrounded it because it's Victorian society. But the illusion is to say that this scholar represents, the female point of view, and science represents the male point of view in Victorian society.
That really is interesting. Yeah, and the whole female, female mediums, I take you. I mean, there were a couple of blokes going around doing the medium circuit, but the majority, as you say, were female. A lot of them were actually using their feminine wiles as well to sell the mediumship by doing their medium stuff in the nuddy.
Yes.
Which I don't believe in it, but I would have gone to see those, over anything else.
And that's it, isn't it? Because Victorian society, it's an interesting thing about why there's so many ghost stories from the Victorian period, when it was a period of enlightenment, wasn't it? Where it was supposed to be, there was questions about religion because science and engineering and bricks, became the order of the day, and flags. The Victorians loved the flag, and so it's that's kind of how we're taught the Victorian thing. It's building bridges and locomotives and going out to America and building railways across other people's land, and that's kind of that period. But actually, literature-wise, there's huge amounts of ghost stories, particularly in the short story genre, and it's mainly ghost as well. It's not like monsters. It's not. There are some vampire stories, and that comes particularly later on. But Edgar Allan Poe came off the back of this. He's like the American side of this, of all these ghost stories, these supernatural stories that became the entertainment, even though the actual society was moving away from the belief of that kind of thing anyway.
Yeah, it would be interesting to try and find out more about that, wouldn't it?
It would be. It's a very interesting. That's why it's a very interesting idea to sort of go into, and it's only through this one. I mean, we've read this is like 61 now or something like that stories, right. And we've done many different things, and it's very nice seeing those criticisms. Like I always say, as you pointed out to me in The Eyes Have It, the McCarthyism through that story.
Yes.
And I think it's one of those, in all the stories we've read, I never realized some of it's overt, in the way that things are sort of like questioning, like with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, she's questioning the role of science and man, taking on the role of God. And this, in a kind of way, is Emily's doing the same sort of thing here, not the role of God, but that kind of idea of. So it's when you look at it through that lens, it suddenly takes on a completely different aspect. When you read it straight, it is a man lost who meets a nut job, who then goes off and gets on a ghost coach, right? So that's your basic plot line. And like you say, it's almost like the Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings, this completely out of context character that just sits in the middle and doesn't seem to serve any real purpose. But then when you look at it from that point of view, and you suddenly go, oh, hang on a second, that historical idea that she was being really subversive with this story, more subversive here than, it was very similar. The start of it was very, very similar to the Parsons story, I thought. That kind of just wandering around, and a story I haven't told anyone else. There was a lot of familiarity at the beginning, to the point where I genuinely thought, I actually went through the list. Have we read this before? Is it under a different name? Is that kind of thing. And it wasn't Emily that wrote the Parsons story as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And with this one, I know that I've read it before. I've read it, might have been for part of my PhD, or it could have just been reading things that are lying around. And that conclusion, genuinely creepy. The main character, I get where you're coming from, but I think I was almost perceiving him as a godlike character when I was reading it at first, as though he'd sort of taken towards some godlike character who knew all these various things about different sciences and different supernatural things, and was sort of like only accessible with a guide taking him somewhere.
So almost like the beginning of a hero's journey, in a way.
Yeah.
So he's like the supernatural intervention that causes him to then go
because it was
step over the world.
He was sort of like isolated. You couldn't get to him directly. You only got to him when you thought, well, it's either this or death. You had to sort of like cheat the gatekeeper to get in. So yeah, there were certain religious kinds of things there. And if we're using him to represent the supernatural, in that case, God representing the supernatural seems like more of a champion of it than God representing science. Or is that just me being sort of like my usual?
No, it's a valid point actually, because because the scholar isn't representing science, is he? The scholar is representing the idea that science isn't looking at things like this. So again, you could actually take that godlike character at that point and say, and call it a religious argument, in that what the scholar is actually saying is that science is not looking at the idea of gods and miracles and that side of things. And if anything happened that was a godlike or miracle thing, that science would just completely write it off and not even look at it. So therefore they are blinding themselves to evidence that might exist because it doesn't align with what they're saying. That's kind of what the scholar was discussing in his work. And so that still works from a God point of view as well, not just a supernatural point of view. If you take it as a religious metaphor, and in which case it still works along those lines, so you can see it as someone who's arguing the point that religion still has a purpose within that thing that isn't being listened to in the same respect.
Yeah, it's, as I say, it was in two halves, and I've listened to it before. When I listened to it again for this recording, I think I've listened to it 2 or 3 times, and it's exquisitely written. I'm not criticizing her writing style at all. She's absolutely spot on with her writing style. It's just that little bit of structure in the middle. But honestly, that was the scariest conclusion to one that we've encountered.
I can't disagree with you. You're absolutely right. It is a story of two completely separate stories going on in the whole thing. And you're right that whole back end description was, and it's in the right part of the story at least as well. At least that didn't happen at an early part of the story. Then he got off the coach and went and spoke to the scholar, because that would have ruined it. It's at least happened in the right way. But yeah, it was so good, that last bit.
So effective, yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, it didn't make sense to love that description, and then in the conclusion, he's saying that he was the 4th passenger in the trip that had happened 9 years previously. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, that makes no fucking sense whatsoever, does it?
Well, it's more to do with ghost stories at that point. I mean, ghost stories don't make sense. There is an illogical side to them, which is, I think, something that you do with a ghost story because you need to make the audience feel uneasy. And by playing with the logic, unless you go really batshit crazy and you instantly reject an idea. But the first point is with this one, I think it's not until you think about it afterwards that you go, no, hang on a second, that makes no sense. Because you're effectively replacing one of the ghosts. Yes. So what happened to the other ghost? And then didn't they all die and he doesn't die? And if he died in the crash, then that would make more sense.
Yeah, but then he wouldn't have been able to say that he was one of the ghosts.
Yes. So I think it's one of those convenient logic leaps that allow the story to be told. They do happen. It's a bit like a plot hole, isn't it? It's kind of like only when you look at it deeply that you go, oh, fucking hell, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like with Jane Eyre, where she sort of like starts off as an orphan, then runs away from the house, and the first house she goes to, she's got relatives living there. Which, yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge leap.
yeah, it's not how orphans work, really, is it? Um,
But there are these huge leaps, aren't there, where you kind of, I mean, Rings of Power have done it recently, where you just kind of go, what are the chances that there's a moment when an army comes in just at the right time for the battle? If they had turned up 10 minutes early, the enemy wouldn't have been there at that moment, and 10 minutes later, the enemy would have left. Everything's just at the right precise timings for everything, and
that was
other
fortunate,
things have
wasn't
to
it?
carry the story at that point for you to just dismiss it, because you say, if the characters are no good, if the story's no good, if you're not invested at that point, those little logic things, which you almost have to do, they're preposterous, but you get away with it because you're already invested in everything else, and it's not until you come back afterwards that you suddenly go, hang on. I was a bit like the classic one in Back to the Future. Now, I like Back to the Future. You like Back to the Future.
Yep.
We both watch pitch meetings, thanks to you.
Yes.
And the pitch meeting guy, I think a lot of people think that he hates the movies, and I don't think he does. I think a lot of the films he enjoys, but he's just really good at picking these moments. And he does the one in Back to the Future where he says, how does Marty know that the future's going wrong? And he says, because I've got this, he's got this photograph, and the people are disappearing in the photograph. And he goes, gee, you mean someone took the time and energy to go to that very spot and take a photograph of nothing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true, yeah. And also, in that same pitch meeting, he sort of like starts asking, so Marty has transferred over to this timeline where things went right for his parents. What happened to the Marty that was living there at the time? And um,
Yeah.
yeah, enormous plot holes when you think about them, which we don't because we want to sort of like we want to carry on enjoying those.
We don't, because we enjoy the story and that kind of thing. So yeah, I and going back to this story is, well, there's the question, isn't it? Is in a funny sort of way, did you enjoy? Forget the idea of linking them together at the minute, because I think that's a different question at the moment. And we know you enjoyed the second story when they're on the coach. Yep. Did you enjoy that first part of the story with the scholar?
It was well written and it was interesting, so yes, I enjoyed it. Yeah, but as much as I enjoyed it, it was overshadowed by that second part. That second part just was absolutely brilliant. It was just annoying that the first part didn't connect to it as seamlessly as I wanted it to. She didn't write it for me. Yeah,
it didn't flow. It's more of a conceptual link rather than being an actual flow through.
And I think it's me that's to blame there. It's not her writing. It's not her. I mean, she wrote it for an audience of her time, and her audience would have sort of like got all of those connections. So it's me being a bloke and living in the 21st century. This is the reason why I don't get what she was trying to say. It's just a shame that, that dissonance has occurred.
Yeah, well, it's that whole thing of what we do here. We don't do critical analysis on anything. We are literally listening to them. And sometimes it's within the conversation or when we do a little bit of research afterwards that we'll find that critical analysis or we'll come up with something. So it's not, I don't think it is, I think anyone reading that story nowadays wouldn't spot that. They wouldn't see it as that at all. And I think you're right. I think there might be, that kind of, me and my friends call it an audience of four. I bet you have the same sort of thing. There are things you put in your writing that are for a very small number of people.
Yeah.
You know that there's certain people that are going to read your book and you put a little thing in just for them, and other people might spot it, but you write it for them. And so I think what she did here was she did write a message in effectively for a small group of people, and in order to sort of like sell this concept. So effectively the whole first part of it became this metaphor for that a certain group of people that were probably her main audience, because women were the big readers of fanciful tales as well. So I think you're right in that analysis, very much so, in that being sort of like a non-Victorian white male that's some almost sort of like 90 years, 80 years away from when it was written. Actually, no, more than that, 160 years away from when it was written, does change that context, doesn't it?
I'm going to say 180 if it was 1840.
Must be 180 then.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So 180 years ago. Let's just take that for a moment at the quality of that writing from 180 years ago. Because
the accessibility of it, yeah.
Yeah. That is stunning in itself when you consider how early it still is in the whole genre of fiction. You know, stunning from that point of view.
Hell of an achievement, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, to not grasp that, I wonder. You know, it's very interesting. I've actually found this, like you say it's one of the most scary ones that we've read, if not the scariest that we have read in that final part. I actually think out of all the stuff we have read, it has. I have found this one the most interesting for the layers underneath it, in a way.
Yeah,
yeah, and it is because it might be that I can go back and look at others, but I look at things like the Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe, you know, he's written some of the stuff. Was that last Edgar Allan Poe we read about the guy that was hypnotized? Stunning, you know, but it feels less layered. It feels like a pure scary story. That's it. You know, without the other layers behind it. And the H.P. Lovecraft, I think I find the same, is he goes to that kind of level of imagination where they are layers of imagination rather than any kind of social meanings or social construct behind them.
Yes.
Where this one, I think, has it has those beautiful. I will say it's a beautiful metaphor that seems to sit behind it. That sort of like that sits within the layers of the story itself. However, I do agree, it's just so episodic, isn't it? It's just like two very distinct stories happening.
Yeah. And I don't think it should be that way. I mean, one of the things that I did in my PhD, because I'd broken down stories into 5 supergenres, and I'd broken the structure down into 3 parts and explained what the beginning, middle, and end was for each one of the genres. I tried to write a story that was a composite piece that had the beginning of one, the middle of another, and the conclusion of a third type. And I achieved it and managed to get something that I sold. So relatively proving that it was of readable quality. But I managed to get them hanging together because they had got a semantic structure running through them. So yeah, whilst it might have been the start of a mystery story and the middle of an adventure story, there was still a different semantic thing going through that made it cohesive. And yeah, I think that's what I was missing, some level of cohesion there.
Yeah. I wonder if he could have done that at the end of, you know, because he does the, all I know is that I was found at the very spot.
Yeah.
Right. And then it goes to its 20 years on. So there's a 20-year gap between the event happening. There's a 29-year gap between the actual crash and where we are listening to the story, and a 20-year gap between his experience with the Phantom Coach and him telling this story. Now, I wonder if he'd gone back to the cottage to go and try and find that cottage over those 20 years. Just a little kind of almost paragraph to go, and I never found that cottage again. Whether that would then add to the mystery of it.
Yes. Yeah, I think that would have done. Yeah, some reference back to something that was such a main character within the central part of the story.
Because I think that is what's missing, isn't it? It never refers, once he's in the hospital, he never talks about the scholar to the doctor. No. He only talks about the experience of the ghost.
Yeah, and you would think he would have tried to make some contact or some... Yes. That's what the damn thing was missing, yes.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's at the end. It's not in the middle, it's at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, tie that back to it. Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't have a callback. And that's a very important thing. I think that's something that a lot of people miss. Because as you know, what part of what we do here is look at the idea of creative writing, and creating callbacks to earlier points in the text is really, really important for connecting the reader to what's happening within the story.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
Brilliant.
That's what was missing from it, right? Yeah, she was broken.
Well, there you go. What a fantastic conversation that ended up being.
Yes. Yeah. What an excellent choice of story.
Superb. Yeah. That was a random one. That was a random pick, that one.
This next one is a random one as well. I was going to pick something else for this week, but
Let me ask the question then. So, Ash, what are we reading this week?
This week, we're reading The Pale Man. It's by Julius Long. It's only a short one. We've not done it already, have we?
No, I know The Pale Man. I know the title. No, what I was laughing at is it's by Julius Long, but it's only a short one.
Kind of ironic, really, isn't it?
The Pale Man. I know that title for some reason. Again, it might be one that I've read, but yeah.
Because I've got a couple of other bits and Christmas is hurtling towards us, the one that I was going to suggest might have been too large a thing for me to take on during the week. So yeah, The Pale Man, Julius Long. I
think going into the new year, we're going to do some new stuff. I've been thinking about what I suggested last week about we are going to effectively write. We're going to do a treatment of a short story live, or recorded it the way that we do it. We're going to sit down with a folk story idea, just the two of us, and talk about how we would turn that into a story. We're going to do that a little bit more next year, I think, just to take things on a little bit, and advance it a little bit. And actually, I do know what you're talking about doing. I'm not going to reveal it just yet, actually, because people will get too excited. They really will.
Yeah.
They'll start jumping up and down and running around, and it's too cold for that.
Spoiling themselves, yeah.
So, it is a very exciting idea that you got for that one. And we're going to do a bit more of that, I think. I think we need to look a little bit more at the idea of adaptations. I really enjoyed the adaptations so far this year.
Same here.
And I'm really into... Have you heard of creative criticism?
No.
Oh,
probably.
It's a new field. It's a very, very new field. And John Schlub up at Lancaster University is really into it. And it's basically funnily enough, we kind of had a discussion about it with adaptation theory, but you use adaptation and you use biographical information to create dramatizations in order to do a critical reading of their work. I think it's sort of like that. I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than what I've just said. It's very, very new. So you take something like I've done with the hole in the wall, for example, and not the hole in the wall, the door in the wall, and by adapting it and by changing it and by then reflecting on the changes that you make, you're able to analyze the original text. And if you did that if I wrote a play about H.G. Wells, for example, instead of it just being a straight play about H.G. Wells, you would then critically look at his work and you use those critiques of his work within the play of his life in order to combine his life with his writing and therefore create a piece of analytical drama.
That does sound fascinating, actually, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to finding out a little bit more about it. This is really skimming the top of it idea, and I'm probably wrong in the way I'm describing it, because you know how that works. You think, I think I've got this. But yeah, it's called creative criticism. And John Oh yeah, it's Schlob, Schleib. I can't remember how to pronounce his name. I'm terribly sorry, John. If you ever get to see this, I'm terrible with pronouncing names. You can ask Ishley here. I'm bad at pronouncing names.
He's that bad that we all call him the Cant. Yeah.
But yeah, so he's really up on it in the field of it. You know, he's one of the pioneers, and I found that very fascinating. And so when I'm going to do my master's, I am actually going to look at doing creative criticism as one of the modules, hopefully, because it's a creative writing way of doing critical analysis.
Oh, right. So yeah, I'm just looking at it now. Right, yeah, that's some fascinating research for me for the rest of the week.
There you go. Yeah, it's all really interesting. There are so many amazing, interesting things going on at the moment in the world of creative writing. It's a very exciting field at the moment, and it's not just about writing stories and selling them off to magazines. There's with all these ideas, you know, like with the sensory storytelling, for example, and
right.
You know, and bringing in all these other sort of like various concepts and looking at it from a critical point of view in terms of writing creatively to be critical. Yeah, it's a very exciting time to look at creative writing, I must admit. And even the discipline of creative writing in itself as an academic study is still very coalface, isn't it, at the moment?
Really is, yeah. Yeah. Which I kind of like that.
Yeah.
I like being on the front edge of it rather than being in the safe side of it. Yes.
I hope we can develop this, because I mean we both live in Blackpool, and it would be very nice to because Lancaster has a very, very strong creative writing reputation, and it would be nice to bring some of that to the Fylde Coast, I think.
Fully agree.
Yeah.
Fully agree.
So, anyways, enough of that. There you go. Bit of nasal gazing there. Nasal
Julius
gazing.
Long.
Hey?
That's looking down your nose at your belly button, isn't it? Yeah.
It's looking down your nose at the Navy.
Yeah.
By.
Yeah. Even better, yes.
So, anyways, look, well, I'm looking forward to that. So we've got Julius Long for The Pale Man. Anyway, it's been a wonderful chat. Thank you very much, Ash.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
See you later, mate. All right.
Later. Bye.
Bye.